is that Mr. Houck's revenge declared open season on pro-life individuals, and they began to vandalize churches and clinics that provide essential resources to expecting mothers. These are the care pregnancy clinics that help millions of women every year. In fact, in the wake of the Dobbs decision, there were over 100 documented acts of violence and vandalism. You see some of the photos of this on display today, committed against these crisis pregnancy centers and churches, and virtually all of it has gone unpunished and unprosecuted. Only 4 individuals have been indicted, and they all came out of the same incident in Florida. Over 100 incidents, and the FBI has turned the other way. Still, members of our committee had the audacity today. Democrats claimed that this was a manufactured crisis, but we put on the evidence and we had the receipts today. We held this hearing to shine a light on this misapplication of justice and the ongoing weaponization of the federal government against people that it was designed to protect. It's our hope that with greater oversight and transparency, we can prevent something like what happened to Mr. Houck and countless others, and bring those to justice who seek to intimidate, threaten, and assault pro-life individuals. I'm happy to turn this over next to my colleague from Texas, Mr. Chip Roy.
Thanks, Mike. Well, I want to thank Mike, who's the chairman of the Constitution Subcommittee, and chaired the hearing that we had this morning regarding the FACE Act, and he just described it ably. I won't repeat any of that. But I do think merits some conversation to the extent to which what Mike just referenced, which is that only in one case in Florida, where you had 4 indictments, you had a situation where it was done for a pregnancy center, right? 0, to the best of my knowledge, for churches. I'm unaware of it ever being used for anything but promotion of the abortion industry. That's what it's being used for. And in fact, in a question, I would just put forth in front of Ms. Camp, who is the lawyer for the National Abortion Federation, formerly a lawyer for the ACLU. And I asked her about a quote from 2015 in which she described, kind of glibly, jokingly, described the crushing of a baby's skull and the sharpness of that skull. I asked her about that quote. She didn't want to talk about it. She wanted to talk about how that somehow then led to violence, right? She didn't want to talk about the ultimate violence, the violence of crushing that baby's skull, or the danger that that poses to young women who are being sold a lie by the abortion industry, that is somehow good for mothers. Somehow that's good for our young women in this society. And she didn't want to talk about it. I understand why. I do. None of us are talking about, particularly glibly, we're not talking about the crushing of baby skulls. That is reserved for those who are carrying out the most violent acts against the most vulnerable living creatures on this planet, a baby in a mother's womb. And that's what we're talking about. And I think it's critically important that we remember the key part of this. If you dare say what I just said without the backing of the United States Capitol, standing here on the Capitol steps as a member of the United States Congress, and if your name is Mark Houck, then my colleagues just acknowledged on the dais that he was targeted because he believes in life and has stood up and defended it. They literally just said it. That is the weaponization of your federal government against the citizens of this country. We saw it yesterday in the Durham report. We see it today in the FACE Act. It is being carried out in countless other ways. It is time that it stops. That is why we submitted a debt ceiling bill that limits spending, tries to cut back on the weaponized federal bureaucracy. We're going to see that through so that we can minimize what's happening to the American citizens, and particularly in this case, the abuse of the FACE Act to trample on free speech, trample on the ability of people to speak out in defense of life, ultimately encapsulated best in the Declaration of Independence, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, right? The inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. With that, I'm going to yield to my colleague, Chris Smith.
Thank you very much, Chip. Chairman Mike Johnston has very, very effectively outlined the dual implementation of justice, the fact that pro-lifers are maltreated, and Chip, again, just did a great job as well. You know, I just want to share a brief story, because I was here when the FACE Act was passed, and I led the effort to make sure that those who were involved with sidewalk counseling were not, unfortunately, gathered up and mistreated pursuant to it. I offered an amendment on it. It did fail, unfortunately. But the FACE Act, Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act, applies to pro-life pregnancy centers. And this administration has been AWOL in implementing it and following up. Share a brief story. 2 women spoke at a pregnancy care center in Middlesex County, New Jersey, that I attended a few years ago. Both women were effusive in their thanks that the director of the pregnancy care center had approached them in absolute kindness and empathy as they were literally walking from the parking lot to an abortion clinic. They changed their minds and were helped through their pregnancy, and after the birth of their children, that help and that love continued. Later in the program, 2 young teenage girls spoke of the sanctity of life, how they were enjoying school, and the good work of the pregnancy care center. From the podium then, they turned to the director and thanked her and said that had she not reached out to their moms that day and followed up with such love and compassion, both of them said they would be dead. Pregnancy care centers across the country have suffered a surge of violent attacks, firebombing, and vandalism by pro-abortion activists in a coordinated effort to intimidate these amazing frontline volunteers and licensed medical professionals, providing this critical support and love to mothers in need and their unborn baby girls and boys. Now more than ever, and that includes the Biden administration, we need to ensure the safety and security of the estimated 3,000 pregnancy care centers that provide life-affirming alternatives to abortion, offering critical quality care for pregnant women facing challenging circumstances and helping to save so many innocent lives. The lives of more than 828,000 unborn babies have been saved in 5 years alone, 2016 to 2000, through the work of pregnancy care centers. The Biden administration should cease their persecution and implement the law.
Thank you, Congressman Smith. I'm so proud to call him my congressman. And thank you also, Congressman Johnson and Roy and Bishop, for helping us bring a voice to this tragedy going on across America. The atrocious and often violent behaviors of those who are so fiercely against the protection of innocent life is staggering. And I want to thank you for highlighting the free help offered to women by thousands of pregnancy centers across the country. My name is Ann O'Connor. I'm from the National Institute of Family and Life Advocates, NIFLA for short. And today I represent them and more than 1,700 pregnancy center members throughout the United States. Just in the last year, more than 80 of them have been vandalized in some way. And do you know how many of those incidents resulted in any kind of arrest? 1. Just 1. Our pregnancy centers, many of whom are made up of volunteers who give their time, energy, and even financial contributions to help women and their families in need, are being hung out to dry by our government, who has so spectacularly failed to not only protect them, but also to pour resources into tracking down the offenders and bringing them to justice. Our centers have distributed millions of dollars in free diapers, clothing, baby gear, plus medical and social services to moms in need, and have walked alongside these women, many of whom have nowhere else to turn. Most weeks, the NIFLA staff hears from at least one center who has been vandalized and needs our assistance. Just last week, one of our centers in Florida was a victim of what is believed to be a satanic ritual attack. The police took more than 2 hours to arrive at the scene, and the FBI took 5 days to even respond to the director's repeated calls for help. If it was an abortion clinic, you know the response would have been immediate. It shouldn't be a political issue to protect those who are being outright attacked in this country, just for doing good. Next, you will hear from Savannah Deritich from Students for Life Action.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for coming out today. My name is Savannah Deritich, and I'm the Government Affairs Coordinator of Students for Life Action. Students for Life of America and Students for Life Action President Kristen Hawkins applauds the House Judiciary Committee for addressing the abuse of the FACE Act as it is applied to peaceful pro-life Americans. The pro-life movement has become increasingly concerned about the injustice experienced by pro-life organizations and activists when dealing with federal agencies, particularly with the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice through their misuse of the FACE Act. It has become progressively obvious that this law is being wielded by the federal agencies in a discriminatory manner towards the pro-life movement. This includes using the FACE Act as a cover to disproportionately discriminate against pro-life activists who have violated the law, as well as agencies turning a blind eye when pro-life pregnancy resource centers are damaged or destroyed by the abortion lobby. And where are the prosecutions for crimes against more than 72 crisis pregnancy centers in 80 Catholic churches that have been attacked or vandalized since the Dobbs leak? Instead, overzealous prosecutions of people like Mark Houck illustrate that weaponized Department of Justice is practicing viewpoint discrimination and prosecutorial choices made. As Students for Life Action President Kristen Hawkins wrote for the Newsweek, threats and acts of violence against pro-life activists are becoming increasingly common. Students for Life students' team members have endured everything from physical attacks and arson to bomb threats and intimidation, making security issues of vital concern and expense for pro-life events. When Justice Brett Kavanaugh, who was seen as a possible pro-life vote, was confirmed to the Supreme Court, protesters stormed at the court, banging on the doors. When people are afraid to use their free speech rights, then they don't truly exist. As pregnancy care centers have burned pro-life centers and hurt volunteers with groups like Students for Life and are threatened and attacked, the Biden administration's so-called Justice Department sees no evil. But praying pro-lifers offend their sensibilities. That viewpoint discrimination must be challenged. Now I have the honor of introducing Janet Durig, Director of Capitol Hill Pregnancy Center.
Thank you, everyone, for being here, and I thank the members of Congress for seeing this as something important, because it is, because we help at the Capitol Hill Pregnancy Center over 2,000 people every year. And that poster that they're standing in front of with the door with the red paint is my building. And on June 1st, early in the morning, a neighbor called and said, your building's been vandalized. And I came in much earlier than I normally do. And I called the police, and they came and they took it very seriously. I have yet to hear from the FBI, and it's been almost a year. We suffered, we had to spend a lot of money. I mean, wonder what happens when something like this happens. So we were fearful for our clients, but we were also fearful for the building. We were able to clean up the damage of the red paint and Jane's Revenge that was on the building. But in the middle of the night, months later, one of our security guards that we had to hire got out of his car and approached a young man who had rented one of the city bikes, and he was photographing all of our windows. And so that obviously scared him and he went away. But the point is that fear is still there for us to wonder about in other pregnancy centers throughout the country. And when you think of all the people that they're helping in a good way, that's just a shame that that's even being allowed, and no one in high up situations in the way of the FBI is taking a real stand, even though they need to through the FACE Act. I would invite any of you reporters, we're within walking distance if you want, be hot today, to come see the center for yourself and let me give you a tour and show you what a pregnancy center does. I have a business card with me, and you can approach me for that, and I'd invite you to come. I think it would do all of you good to understand what happens. I'm going to close with one question. When did keeping your baby stop being one of the choices? When did that happen? I don't know. It's my pleasure to introduce Brian Birch. He is the president of the Catholic Vote.
Thank you, everyone. Very grateful to be here and certainly honored to be here with the witnesses that testified before the Judiciary Committee this morning. My name is Brian Birch and I represent Catholic Vote. We are a lay organization comprised of over 500,000 members, and I'm here to speak on behalf of millions of Catholics nationwide who have watched in horror over the last 3 years as hundreds of our churches have been vandalized and attacked. And now, since the Dobbs decision, crisis pregnancy centers that care for women in need have also come under repeated attack and violence. I think it's important to note that this is not something that happened in the past. These attacks continue to this day. We have kept a tracker map on our website that is updated every single day, and rarely a week does not go by before we are adding yet another incident to this tracker. Catholics nationwide have sacrificed for decades, stuffing baby bottles with loose change, bake sales, collections, praying on their knees, and counseling outside of pregnancy centers like Mark Houck does. Catholics do not deserve the treatment that they are now being received by their government. We are now seeing at the highest levels of government the weaponization of the Department of Justice in its misapplication of the law and, frankly, its dereliction of duty in refusing to prosecute these crimes. These pregnancy centers provide things like free diapers, free food, free counseling, and free hugs. And these are the things that are under attack, not buildings, not people, but vulnerable women seeking real choices, and Catholics are proud to stand with them, and we want our government to do the same. Thank you all for being here, and we look forward to further actions from our organization as well as Congress to do everything they can to hold both this administration and our government accountable as they are constitutionally obligated to do. Thank you very much.
We'll take some questions here in a moment. I just want to tell you that two of our star witnesses from the hearing this morning are standing behind me. Jeremy Dice, raise your hand. He's the tall guy in the back. He's senior counsel with First Liberty Institute, which is the nation's largest organization dedicated exclusively to the defense of religious liberty for all Americans. And he's done a lot of work in the legal arena defending some of these pregnancy care centers
Where's
that have been
First Liberty
targeted.
based, Mike?
They're in Texas,
Oh, yeah.
but that's the side note. And then also standing behind me is Tammy Coker. And Tammy did an excellent job in committee today. She's the executive director of New Life Family Services. They're in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, one of the oldest and most comprehensive pregnancy care centers in the country. And on March 6th of this year, just a couple months ago, Jane's Revenge graffitied one of their facilities, and they painted the abortion. I think we have a photo up here. If abortions aren't safe, then neither are you. They smashed windows, and she testified this morning they had to spend over $60,000 in some immediate measures to protect their facilities, and that's $60,000 plus that could go to great use helping women in crisis pregnancies. And so it's a real shame that this is going on. Let me take some questions if anybody has them.
Pro-choice, I'm Kate Scanlon, I'm with OSB News. Pro-choice advocates will argue that we've seen an uptick in abortion clinics as well as pro-life centers post-Dobbs. Can you speak to what you've come across in your research when you've been documenting these incidents at pro-life centers and what it maybe says about a wider culture of violence that we're experiencing now?
Yeah, it was very interesting in the hearing today. Mr. Roy pointed this out, and we noticed that the Democrats' witness from the National Abortion Federation cited FBI statistics about attacks on the other side, but she had no FBI statistics on the pro-life centers. And it's interesting that the FBI apparently is not taking those statistics. You know, they took no action on the pro-life side of this to go after any of these 100 documented incidents of vandalism on pro-life centers and churches since Dobbs, since the leaked opinion. And it was really interesting. We had to pass a resolution on the House floor here in late February, as I recall. I wrote the resolution demanding action by the FBI, and it was only 6 days after that that they finally took notice and began to pay attention to a few of these incidences. So do we have a rise in violence across the country? We do. But what we rely upon is the Department of Justice to enforce the law and to do it equally and to protect everybody on all sides. And there's been a greater increase in the pro-life side than anything.
Yeah, I just want to add is that, as Mike just said, I mean, justice is supposed to be blind. Right? That's the core issue here that we're discussing. if this were all being enforced equally, right? If there's violence being levied against, an abortion facility, we would agree that shouldn't be occurring under the law. You follow the law, right? As a former federal prosecutor, you prosecute the case in front of you. And that's not what we're seeing, though, right? We're seeing, for example, there is a very specific statute that says you cannot go and intimidate a justice at their home. The Department of Justice is completely MIA, while pro-choice activists are going and picketing outside of Supreme Court justices' home. Well, why are they doing that? It's to intimidate judges. That's exactly what it's for. That's why the statute exists. Yet they're not doing it. Any of these violent acts across the spectrum have local laws prohibiting virtually all of them. And so local law enforcement is frankly where most of this stuff is supposed to occur. But what you see out of the Department of Justice is selective enforcement, going after Mark Houck, not going after abuses that are levied against crisis pregnancy centers, not going after these folks who are trying to harass judges and so forth.
That's well said. Another question?
Is there any plan to repeal FACE?
Well, the purpose of the hearing this morning was to talk about the abuses as we see in the application of it, and to determine as a committee in the House Judiciary Committee whether we need some reforms to the act and whether we should amend it in some way to make sure that this is appropriately exercised by the DOJ. So we'll have a lot of discussions, I think, after this hearing. There was some very important information that came out today, and that'll be part of the discussion and the analysis.
You said there weren't great numbers, but that there's more attacks here than on abortion clinics. How do you get that data?
Well, we've been collecting it because we had to do it on our own, and there are organizations, for example, the Family Research Council was present in the hearing today and presented evidence. They have a report that's about this thick, documenting all the attacks on churches, for example, in that case, and it followed the leak of the Dobbs opinion. And they even went back further over the last 5 or 6 years, as I recall, and there are hundreds and hundreds of examples of this. We had photos in the hearing, they're presented in the record, where, a church, for example, Jane's Revenge paints on the side of a church, abort the church, right? It's any pro-life organization, any pro-life congregation that stands for life, they have been the subject of attack. And we saw those attacks escalate in the wake of the Dobbs leak and in the days since. And they're still continuing, as we noted. This one happened just in the last 60 days or so. So it's a real problem that we have to address. Congress has done what we can, but we need the Department of Justice to do its job, and that's what we're calling upon them to do. No other questions? Well, we thank you all for being here. We really thank our witnesses and these advocates who are here. Yeah, one more question? Go ahead.
I'll try to make it brief. I'm sorry I wasn't prepared. Look, I'm sure we all want equal protection under the law. The law would be enforced equally and justly. But I'm one of 25 people still being indicted and charged with FACE Act violations, allegedly. All right? We may not all get off as easily as Mr. Hope did. Considering the 5th and 14th Amendments of the Constitution say no person should be denied right to life, and that the whole justification for the FACE Act in the first place was the 14th Amendment, that supposedly abortion was a constitutional right, which has been, the Dobbs case has thrown that completely away. We know that it's not a constitutional right. Shouldn't we be calling simply for, not for an equal application of the FACE Act, but for simply the FACE Act to be disposed of, for law enforcement who knows their job, not to arrest people who interfere with the acts of a criminal enterprise, like an abortion clinic? I'm sorry if that's too much to answer in one roll. But
no, look, it's a great question. I mean, this is part of the discussion, the analysis we're going through. The FACE Act was a bipartisan effort back in the 90s because they saw an escalation of attacks, but it was supposed to cover both sides. And it's sad, it's unfortunate that you need a federal statute to basically enforce and uphold our fundamental freedoms, and the right to free speech and the right to religious liberty are among the most fundamental freedoms that we have. Next, of course, to the right to life, as Chip Roy pointed out in the Declaration of Independence. So, look, I think this is part of the discussions that we'll be having, and we'll be open to thoughts from people about how we should handle this going forward. We're in a new day. We're in an unprecedented time right now, and it's a dangerous time as well. So, yeah, Chris Smith, he's the chair of the Pro-Life Caucus, by the way.
Chris Smith from New Jersey. I was here when we fought against Schumer's efforts to criminalize mere physical obstruction, and that is the part of FACE that is egregious and wrong. I offered an amendment that said force or threat of force. This is a movement that is absolutely founded on nonviolence. We believe in the sanctity of life, including those with whom we are diametrically opposed and disagree with. So, my amendment said do that. But the mere physical obstruction, if I'm standing and it's all in the eyes of the beholder, so someone could say if you're on a sidewalk doing counseling, you're in violation of FACE, and that is wrong and continues to be wrong. But again, the forced part violence, and that is what is happening against the pregnancy care centers. There's just an escalation, and thankfully, pro-lifers are not intimidated. They stand up, and they are just strong and courageous because they love them both, mother and child.
And we'll continue to stand for the sanctity of every single human life. Thank you all for being here. Sorry about the hot weather. We appreciate your patience.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.